Welcome to the post-project world. I'm Luigi Rondanini. Last month, I published an essay about something that most people in AI circles got wrong. They called it a productivity breakthrough. They called it a developer innovation. It's neither. Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, or MCP, is the beginning of something far more significant than faster code generation or smarter autocomplete. It is the start of machine-mediated organizational infrastructure. And if you understand what that means, you understand what the post-project world actually looks like. Today, I want to connect three dots that most people still haven't connected. First, what MCP actually is and why the current framing is almost entirely wrong. Second, why it matters fundamentally to how organizations operate, not as a productivity lever, but as a governance problem. And third, and this is the critical one, how it exposes a fundamental truth about organizational infrastructure that we've been avoiding for the better part of a decade. Let me start with the framing problem. For the last year, almost every conversation about AI coding assistants has been dominated by a single narrative: productivity, faster generation, smarter autocomplete, boilerplate reduction, refactoring help, natural language debugging. All of that is true, technically, but also, and I want to be direct here, ultimately incremental. That narrative is wrong. Not because those things don't matter, they do, but because they're describing the wrong layer of the stack entirely. It's like looking at an operating system and only discussing the speed of the file search function. Technically accurate, strategically missing the point. Here's what actually matters. For the last several years, large language models have been confined to conversational space. That's their operational boundary. They explain, they summarize, they generate, they reason probabilistically over information you give them. But they have been fundamentally disconnected from operational systems. They cannot actually do anything in the world except produce text. The text goes to a human. The human decides what to do with it. That's a critical boundary. MCP changes that boundary. Suddenly, an AI model can inspect repositories, traverse file systems, interact with Jira, query databases, read enterprise documentation, operate browser sessions, validate workflows, orchestrate actions across multiple systems. The model is no longer a conversational artifact. It becomes an execution participant. That is not a productivity enhancement. That is a reconfiguration of organizational infrastructure. And once you make that transition from conversation to execution, the central problem shifts entirely. Intelligence is no longer the limiting factor. Governance is. Most people have not thought carefully about what it means for AI systems to move from conversational space into execution space. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine Claude is being asked to approve an expense exception. In a conversational context, Claude can say something reasonable. This seems like a reasonable exception to the standard policy. Fine, that's conversation. You read it. You decide what to do. But now imagine Claude can actually execute that approval. Claude can write to the database. Claude can update the approval status in the system. Claude can notify the person who submitted the request. Claude can log the action in the audit trail. Suddenly, we're no longer in conversation. We're in governance territory. And governance territory has entirely different rules. In governance territory, you cannot simply ask, "What happened?" You must be able to answer, "Why?" Why did the system approve this particular request? You must be able to reconstruct the decision lineage. You must verify that the person approving had the authority to approve. You must check that policy constraints were satisfied. You must ensure that the operation is auditable. You must verify that the action aligns with regulatory requirements. You must know with certainty that the action was admissible before the system calculated whether it should be executed. That's the critical distinction. This is where most current AI implementations fail spectacularly. They calculate answers first. This seems reasonable. Then they try to execute them. Then they discover, sometimes too late, that the calculated answer violated governance constraints. That works fine for chat. An AI can generate text. You can read it, you can evaluate it, you can decide whether to act on it. It is catastrophic for organizational infrastructure. Because infrastructure operates at scale. Infrastructure operates across systems simultaneously. Infrastructure is accountable. You cannot have accountable infrastructure that calculates before verifying admissibility. You cannot have infrastructure that executes first and checks governance constraints after. Now, let me connect this to something deeper. The post-project world is not a prediction about the future. It's an observation about how organizations are actually starting to operate and how they will have to operate once they take governance seriously. For the last 50 years, organizations have structured themselves around projects, discrete chunks of work, defined start and end points, temporary teams assembled for a purpose, then disbanded. Projects are a governance construct. They create boundaries, they create authority structures, they create deliverables and close-out procedures. They create reporting hierarchies and accountability chains. But projects also create friction, enormous friction. The overhead of constantly assembling teams, establishing authority, running governance cycles, closing out work, re-establishing baselines for the next project, managing handoffs between teams. That overhead is massive. We just don't see it as a problem because we've normalized it. When you look at actual organizations, a staggering amount of capital is spent on coordination overhead, meetings, escalations, approvals, routing delays, context transfer between teams, governance friction, operational synchronization. We treat that as managerial overhead. The cost of doing business, it's not overhead, it's infrastructure. And it's infrastructure that we've accepted as inevitable for so long that we no longer even see it as a problem. The post-project world emerges when organizations start operating directly on that coordination infrastructure layer, rather than accepting it as an inevitable friction cost. And here's where MCP becomes relevant. MCP is an architectural pattern for machine-mediated coordination. Think about what that means. In a project-based organization, coordination is handled by humans, project managers, executives, approval chains, hierarchical routing, decision-making committees. That creates bottlenecks. It creates latency. It creates the need for constant context transfer between people and teams. But it also creates governance boundaries. It creates clear authority structures. It creates accountability mechanisms. It creates auditability. What happens when you try to automate that coordination layer with AI systems? You have to solve a fundamentally different problem. You can't just ask, can the AI system perform this action? You have to ask, is the AI system permitted to perform this action? Does it have authority? Is the action admissible? What constraints apply? How do we reconstruct the decision? And suddenly, you're not just building smarter automation. You're building governance infrastructure that operates differently from how project-based governance works. You're building post-project world infrastructure. Let me make this concrete. In a traditional project-based organization, here's how approvals work. A person submits a request. The request goes through an approval chain. Different people at different levels review it. Different people verify different constraints. Someone checks budget. Someone checks policy compliance. Someone checks technical feasibility. Someone ultimately says yes or no. That process is slow. It's expensive. But it has built-in governance. Each step in the chain is a human decision maker. Each person brings judgment. Each person can ask clarifying questions. Each person understands the context and the intent behind the policy. Now imagine you try to automate that chain using AI. You want the system to be faster. You want the system to be more consistent. You want the system to eliminate unnecessary bottlenecks, but you cannot eliminate the governance. So what does that look like? First, you need admissibility verification. Before the AI system makes a decision, It must verify multiple things. Is the person submitting the request authorized to submit it? Does policy permit this type of request? Has this person already exhausted their request quota? Is there sufficient documentation attached? Can we reconstruct the decision lineage for an auditor? Only after all those questions are answered does the AI system move to calculation. Second, you need authority resolution. The AI system needs to know not just the mechanics of routing, but the governance intent. Why does this approval hop go to this person? What are they specifically checking for? What constraints are they responsible for enforcing? What happens if they deny the request? Third, you need execution lineage. Every action the AI system takes must be traceable in detail. Not just what happened, but why did it happen that way? What data informed the decision? What policies were evaluated? What thresholds were checked? What exceptions were considered? Fourth, you need admissibility control. The AI system cannot just calculate an answer and then discover it violates policy. The policy constraints must be baked into the decision-making framework from the start. The system must be designed to know what is admissible and what is not before it attempts to calculate. This is not theoretical. This is what mature AI adoption looks like in regulated environments. Banks, insurance companies, healthcare organizations, financial services firms, any organization where compliance matters. They cannot use AI systems that calculate first and check governance after. And here's where the architecture really matters. If your AI system is operating through a SaaS intermediary, a third-party platform that controls the model, controls the routing, controls the audit trail, you have a dependency problem. Because if that intermediary changes their retention policy, you have limited options. If they start using your data to train their models, you negotiate. If they shift your infrastructure to a new region to save costs, you discover it after it happens. You negotiate. But if your AI system is built on BYOK, bring your own key, you control the provider relationship, you control model selection, you govern retention policies, you set audit boundaries, you determine data handling, and if you need to migrate, you migrate. That difference is not technical preference. That is governance architecture. And governance architecture is where the post-project world gets built. Here's the deepest insight I want to land. Organizations do not optimize for coordination. They tolerate it. Coordination is treated as overhead, friction, the cost of doing business. But coordination is not overhead. Coordination is infrastructure. Coordination infrastructure includes meetings, escalations, approvals, routing, context transfer, decision-making processes, authority structures, accountability mechanisms, compliance verification. All of that is infrastructure, and organizations spend enormous hidden amounts of capital on that infrastructure. The time people spend in meetings is coordination capital. The time spent waiting for approvals is coordination capital. The time spent transferring context between teams is coordination capital. The time spent managing exceptions and overrides is coordination capital. For decades, we've accepted that infrastructure cost as inevitable. But what if it doesn't have to be? What if you could build AI systems that operate directly on the coordination layer, not to eliminate coordination? Coordination is necessary. You need authority. You need accountability. You need policy enforcement. But what if you could make coordination infrastructure visible, measurable, and governable? That is the post-project world. That is what MCP enables. MCP is not fundamentally about coding. It's not about productivity enhancements. MCP is an architectural pattern for building machine-mediated coordination infrastructure. And once you build that infrastructure, you can start to measure it. You can start to optimize it. You can start to understand where coordination capital is actually being spent. You can move from treating coordination as overhead to treating it as a measurable, governable asset. That changes everything about how organizations operate. The future is not better, chat. It's not autonomous agents roaming through your systems doing whatever they want. The future is governed machine-mediated execution infrastructure, which means AI systems operating across enterprise systems, but with policy-enforced constraints at every step. Orchestration that is admissibility controlled from the start, not patched in after calculation. Authority resolution that is structured, transparent, and auditable. Execution lineage that is audit-grade and reconstructible. Coordination infrastructure that is measurable and governable. This is why protocols like MCP matter so much. They are not developer tooling innovations. They are not convenience mechanisms. They are early indicators of a much larger architectural transition. The migration of organizational coordination itself into machine-mediated infrastructure, and once that transition begins, governance becomes the primary design problem, not intelligence, not capability, not speed, governance. The organizations that understand this first, that understand that machine-mediated execution requires governance-first design, those organizations will build post-project world infrastructure. They will move beyond project-based coordination overhead. They will make coordination visible and measurable. They will optimize at a layer that has been invisible to most organizations for decades. That is the post-project world. And that's why I'm focused on this now. Not because it's the future, but because it's how the organizations that matter most will operate. Thank you for listening to the Post-Project World. I'm Luigi Rondanini. You can find my work at orbaos.com and Rondanini Publishing. The Post-Project World book is coming at the end of 2026. Until then, explore the ideas at OrbaOS. See you next time.